This is Detroit.
At one time, the fourth most populated city in the country and one of the wealthiest. Well, it's now becoming the largest city in American history to file for bankruptcy.
Riding across Detroit, nothing new for decades. In part, the hood resembles a war zone. As time passes, more and more buildings abandoned and set on fire.
For $1, you can buy those for $1. They just break in and steal anything valuable that they can get: plumbing, hot water tank, furnace.
Just desolation, the complete absence of bodies. The houses are there in some form of decay, empty shops, but there's no one.
The downtown died, became a ghost town. So you have all of these skyscrapers with no one in them.
But this was Detroit. As a content creator, cybersecurity and data protection has become extremely important to me. Since my YouTube channel has grown, I've gotten a massive influx of scam calls and attempted sign-ins into my account, and it's genuinely worrying. I know one of the reasons I was getting so many spam texts and calls is because big companies can't keep our data safe. As I talked about last time, recently, AT&T revealed that nearly all of their customers' call and text records had been exposed in a massive data breach. And it hasn't even been a few months since they admitted over 70 million of their users' social security numbers ended up on the dark web. The stolen logs also contain a record for every number AT&T customers called or texted. So even if you don't use AT&T, if someone who texted you did, then your number has been exposed. So what can you do to protect yourself? You can use Aura, like I do, the sponsor of today's video. Aura will alert me if they find my phone number or any other sensitive information that has been compromised. And they give me fast fraud alerts if anyone tries to use that data to access my credit or bank accounts. Aura does so much to keep me and my family safe too. I also get things like transaction monitoring, a VPN, antivirus, a password manager, parental controls, and identity theft insurance. I get all of this in one app at one affordable price. I can also get their AI-powered call assistant that will pick up unknown calls on my behalf to screen them for spam and scams. The AI forwards legitimate calls to me, so I don't miss appointments, deliveries, and emergencies. And it protects me from harmful text messages by filtering out known spam numbers and scanning links in the message for phishing threats. I'm not leaving myself and my family vulnerable to data breaches, and if you don't want to either, you can go to aura.com/AlexanderOttmans and try your first 2 weeks for free, all linked below in the description. Well, here we are. This is where the series was always going to come to at some point, as it should. Detroit is the archetype of the fallen American city, particularly in the conversation of the post-war period. I am certainly not the first person to discuss this city and its downfall, but I won't get too deep into the exact details or nuances of it even, but what I will focus on is the urbanist perspective. How Detroit went from beautiful, bustling, and well-connected to desolate, ugly, and obsessively suburban. Detroit, incorporated in 1815, was built to emulate the Parisian boulevards, with wide diagonal roads sprouting from the city center connecting to surrounding neighborhoods. A hub for shipping, trade, and industry, Detroit became a wealthy city alongside nearby Chicago, and upon the Gilded Age, which brought about some of the best city building and architecture throughout the country, Detroit was blessed with some absolutely beautiful neighborhoods, becoming some of the country's first suburbs. However, unlike nowadays where the mansions and wealthiest neighborhoods are the most far out and remote, in late 19th century Detroit, these mansions were built along the main urban boulevards, such as Woodward Avenue, the main road that funnels directly into the city from the north, as these were the most convenient places to get to local shops and amenities, as well as the streetcar to reach the city center, proving that transit, when done right, is actually quite desirable for the wealthy, even in America. But nowadays, from what survives, such as the David Whitney House, looks almost hilariously out of place, showing just how backwards city planning has become in recent decades. Just imagine how this place would have looked with these grand houses lining the entire length of the street on either side all those years ago. Eventually, in the early 20th century, the automotive industry sprang to life in Detroit, initiated by Henry Ford, making America's rich manufacturing hub even richer. And this was directly reflected in the absolutely beautiful city that was built from it, being referred to as the Paris of the West, and being the wealthiest city in the country, ahead of New York, Chicago, and San Francisco. Unthinkable in today's world. And by 1920, it was the fourth largest city in the country, and would remain in the top 5 quite easily until the 1980s. But from here, Detroit essentially became a victim of its own success. Its booming industry led to a massive wave of migration, particularly from the South. And unfortunately, despite Michigan being a northern state, many of the racial problems of the South at the time carried over into the city. Race riots, KKK presence, and restrictions of blacks to purchase homes outside of certain neighborhoods led to segregation, hostility, and the making of some of Detroit's first problematic neighborhoods that have lived on to this day. The high-trust society that had mansions be built along the main boulevards was quickly fleeting. On top of this, and perhaps much more damaging to the city's future, was the takeover of car-centric infrastructure throughout the country, as Henry Ford became one of the most powerful men in the nation, and the automotive industry becoming one of the most powerful in the US. Until the mid-20th century, cars ran alongside the pedestrian and transit-based societies of the pre-modern age, in a way that people like myself would think of as the ideal scenario for today. But of course, the automotive industry understood that the more people had to drive, the more money that would come their way. And with the huge amount of influence Ford and the auto manufacturers had, they got exactly what they wanted. And so, the virus that is car-centric city planning and infrastructure that has spread throughout the country was born out of Detroit, certainly ideologically, but also literally, as the first expressway built in the United States was here, the Davison. Half a block of homes were removed along 30 streets to make way for it, but this was nothing compared to what would come next. Throughout the 40s, 50s, and 60s, blocks were raised to become parking lots, streets were widened everywhere, the highly interconnected streetcar system was ripped up from the ground, and highways, highways, highways. The buildings, squares, and homes that made up America's Paris were simply in the way, and the city has never looked back. And the rise of modernism certainly had its role to play as well, scattering ugliness throughout the once beautiful city. Detroit had quickly become unrecognizable from its glory days. And ever since, the social problems have only exacerbated, and economically, the city was hit hard. Manufacturing famously left Detroit, and it left behind a city that was a shell of its former self. As I've said on this series before, while the economic situation was of course a death blow to Detroit, it's especially hard for a city to evolve and rise again when its heart and soul had been blown to pieces. Look at these images and you'll see what I mean. This is a result of the systematic and intentional destruction of Detroit. What people need to understand is that while Detroit itself has become emptier and more desolate, the Detroit metro area is doing somewhat alright. Home to 3.7 million people, technically, much more people call Detroit home now than at any other point in history. So then, where are they? Well, this one image answers that question. While Detroit's metro population has moderately been increasing, this is at the periphery of the urban area, and the suburbs are so vast that in several directions you have 40 to 50 miles of non-stop urban and suburban development, and growing, as the city itself continues to suffer and deplete. While I don't blame anybody for not wanting to live in urban Detroit given its high crime and low quality amenities, this is still an absolute travesty, considering they've abandoned the former wealthiest city in the country, and highlights how broken urban planning and city governance is in this country. And while there is a known small-scale renaissance in downtown Detroit, it doesn't quite have the appreciation of the past, let alone the ambition to rebuild the beauty of the past, that would allow for the Paris of the West to rise again in its former glory. But perhaps the surviving relics of that time that remain will one day inspire us to realize that Detroit's best future requires us to turn the page back in the history books. And this also serves as the ultimate warning of what can happen to any of our great cities, as no one in 1930s Detroit would have ever predicted such a fall from grace. Thank you for watching. I'll see you next time.